All right, folks, and welcome back to Cyber Spotlight, the people behind security. Today, I am very lucky to be joined by Mr. Alan Brill of Kroll. He is the Senior Managing Director and founder of the cyber risk practice at Kroll, and he's got a wealth of knowledge and experience in the field, so we're lucky to have you today. Thanks, Alan, for joining the show.
My pleasure.
Yeah, we're excited to get into a little bit more of your background and just find out how you got into cybersecurity and all of that, and then get some insights on the recent events in the cyber field. So let's start off with kind of what's a quick background of how you got into the field and what drew you into wanting to get into the line of work you do now.
In the early 1970s, I had left active duty in the Army, although I was still active in the reserves. And I joined the accounting firm then known as Ernst & Ernst, now EY. And as we were working in the consulting unit, we came to understand that the evolution of technology was such that more and more companies that we were auditing had more and more dependencies on these new kind of things called computers. And that they were becoming a significant part of the audit. You couldn't really continue to audit around the computer. You had to be able to audit through the computer. And from there, one of my close friends and colleagues and I realized that nobody had really been thinking about the security of the computer. It was kind of like, well, we don't understand it, so who could understand it? So what could go wrong? And we were pretty convinced by 1974 that there was a lot that could go wrong. And we started putting together a methodology for reviewing those computers. And we started working on it and using it. I was called onto active duty that summer and was asked to do what I think was the first data system security review of a military computer center. And I did it, and the general who ran the center was not thrilled with me because I think we had exfiltrated some highly classified data within about 12 minutes. And fortunately, I wasn't working for that general. I was working for a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense who was very happy with the results. And we took that back, and for the years that I was at Ernst, we did that. I then left and went to work with Ed Jordan. Ed Jordan was the guy who had developed structured programming and structured analysis. And I spent a few years with Ed expanding the theory to include security control aspects when you were designing and building the systems. From there, I went back into government. I went into the New York City government, first as a deputy inspector general and later as director at the New York City Department of Investigation, where we opened up the city's first cyber investigations unit, looking at internal frauds against the city. And we got some of the early hackers. We built some of the early local area networks. We built some of the larger scale networks. And we tried right from the design, from the beginning, to think about security, auditability, and control, and build them into systems. When I had the opportunity to join Kroll, it was because there was that recognition that systems could go wrong. And that when you were doing an investigation, and Kroll is an investigative firm, that's what its DNA is. If the evidence is going to be in a computer, you have to be able to deal with that evidence in a forensically sound manner,
right,
so that it will be admissible in some future civil or criminal litigation. And there weren't a lot of good ways to do that. We didn't have the forensic software that we had now. We had some utility programs, but beyond that, if you knew what you wanted to do, you had to go write it yourself. And that's obviously what we did. And over time, we've evolved to understand that systems, by their very nature, involve risk, and Kroll focuses on risk. So being able over the years to work with companies to have them recognize that risk and manage that risk actively so that you weren't basing your security program on chance, but you had a plan and you're executing that plan was how I evolved and how the practice evolved. So we're up over 300 people now, and we've really been recognized within the organization as providing a really important and central service, not just within the cyber community, but within the larger investigative community as well.
Yeah, that's really cool to see the evolution of cybersecurity, and it seems like you've had a really important part in that. So that's just a really cool resume. Now, if you, and especially with the news, obviously, that we see constantly on the cyber front here, which we'll get into a little bit later. But if if you're in an elevator with someone, and you had someone kind of being a little investigating you, maybe pesking you a little bit, and you had to explain what you do now in your role to somebody in like 30 seconds, what would you say?
My role has really evolved into one of an expert in the field who can serve as an expert witness, an expert advisor on complex litigation cases, and to try to provide a way of explaining what are in reality complex cyber issues in a way that a trier of fact, whether it's a judge or a jury or an arbitration panel, is going to be able to understand, not in terms of purely the technology, but really in terms of common sense. Because if you can't do that, you're going to have trouble communicating with not just a judge, but a CEO, a board member, and having them understand why what we do is central to their business is life and death vital.
Mm. Yeah, like the soft skills of being able to communicate it. Yeah, and you're at the higher level now of like kind of coming in to those things and explaining it. That's really cool. Since COVID has started, we're kind of hopefully on the way out of it now. Has there been any changes to how your job functions or the firm does business, or is it mainly the same type of things?
Well, internally, our practice was largely decentralized before COVID hit. We had developed ways of managing our data in our laboratories to give access to that data in a very secure way to our forensic engineers. But the real issue wasn't us. The real issue was what happened to our clients.
Right.
Because if you think about it, they had to make huge transitions from a traditional in-office operation to a widely decentralized work from home environment. And sometimes they had to do that within days.
Yeah.
And that meant, in a lot of cases, major shifts in how their networks were being configured, how people were connecting to their network through a home router as opposed to a direct wired connection in the office. It also meant that the cybersecurity people were disrupted because the tools that they used in the office every day weren't going to be instantly available to them. And all of the ways that they did business had to be modified so that a lot of them could be done remotely. And again, remember, you didn't have a lot of time to prepare. You were out of that office sometimes within days. So there was a great deal of tap dancing, of smoke and mirrors, to get to the point where you could operate in as effective a way and as secure and privacy respecting a way as you were doing before COVID hit.
Right. Yeah, and at Plurilock, that's what we help people with is the authentication of the identity side of things with that, because that's been the big story in cybersecurity over the last year and a half, right? Is that scramble to get set up in the remote environment.
Sure, because you know what I think people forget about authentication. If you say to somebody, well, how do you authenticate? They'll always give you the big three, right? Oh, it's something you have, something you know, something you are. But there was a fourth one that was always very important that we largely lost during COVID, and that's where you are,
Hmm.
right? Because you were usually connected to a network in an office, in a locked, secured environment where you weren't doing everything over the air. You were working in a physical network situation, and we had to give that up suddenly.
Yeah.
So one of the major authentication tools saying, Stephen is in the office and he's in the office, and I know it's him because he had to go through 2 cipher lock doors and sign in with a guard and have a badge. So I know it's him in front of the computer. And we didn't have that suddenly. So the paradigms that we use for authentication in most cases changed radically and changed suddenly. And that's not an easy change to make, particularly for a large organization, very quickly.
Totally. Couldn't agree more. And with that, how does identity, because that's obviously that's what you're trying to authenticate, who is it that's wanting to do
Yeah.
this? How does identity play into that grander kind of vision of cybersecurity for you and the risk side of things?
To me, risk is a function of, do we give the data to the right person? But it's also the flip side of that, Stephen. It's, do we give the right data to the right person?
Hmm.
So one of the things that you have to look at, and in the US, this is particularly true because of a recent Supreme Court decision known as Van Buren, is we don't want to give people access to data that they don't actually need to do their job. Now, it's
Right.
certainly easier to give people less granular access. Oh, yeah, sure, you can look at all the accounts. But what the Supreme Court told us in Van Buren was that under the US federal computer crime statute, once somebody has access to data, you can't say, well, you didn't use it the way that I wanted you to use it.
Oh.
In the Van Buren case, it was a police officer who accepted a payment to look up for somebody who owned a certain car and give them that information without authorization. And the court said, well, you gave the officer access to that data. You can't really now say, well, I don't like how you used it. So it drives us to think about how we assign data. Once we know who it is, then it's not just enough to say, well, it's Mary, it's Joe, it's Sally, so I trust them. But it's really looking objectively and saying, what do they need to be trusted with to do their job properly?
Right. Yeah. And that's obviously so central now to the existence, like we talked about before getting on here, of businesses, because it can be a massive risk. Getting more into some of the breaches that have happened in 2021. Obviously, they've been all over the news, and I'm sure you guys are very aware of these. What are some of the big lessons that we as a cybersecurity community at large should be taking from this year's barrage of major cyber attacks?
Yeah, we're in an interesting position. When these incidents occur, whether it's the CU1 this past week, whether it's SolarWinds, whether it was the Microsoft Exchange issue, we get to see a lot of those cases. And we don't just try to look at them on a case-by-case basis, But we try to have our intelligence unit look at these and say, well, what can we learn? What lessons are there to be drawn? So in the current case, we've just seen some recent analysis that indicates that the bad guys were able to go from showing that it worked to deploying it on a wide scale within a period of a few hours. So there's not going to be a lot of warning when these things happen. And you can't simply say, well, I license X and Y and Z and I use them and I've always used them and they're really somebody else's problem. So I'm not going to worry about them. Not anymore. Yes, you license them. Yes, they belong to somebody else. Yes, you use them every day. But if you don't recognize that those bear risk, and it's risk that if it hits is going to affect you, you're making a mistake. So what do you want to do? You want to maintain close liaison with the companies you deal with. You want to make sure that if something is going on, they have a way to let you know and to let you know right now, not when they have a couple of days to work on a news release, not after they've manipulated it 9 ways till Sunday, but right now.
Yeah.
You want an early warning that if nothing else says shut it down, if that's appropriate. So the first thing to do is to make sure you have those communications in place and open. You don't want them wondering how to get a hold of you, particularly recognizing that the bad guys are very smart. They know when holiday weekends occur, and they love to launch attacks at the very beginning of a holiday weekend because people go away. Cybersecurity people go away. It may be harder to get that response going, maybe harder to find those people. They may not be looking at their smartphones to see if there's an urgent message. So you want to recognize that this is the reality we deal with. And you want to recognize that you need a way of responding that's based upon what's really going on, that the risk factors are materializing faster than ever. They are materializing in more devastating ways than ever. So where you would advise somebody to have monitoring looking for unusual activity, like things leaving your network or activity associated with software that you don't usually associate with that software, it seems to me that this is moving from the experimental to nice to have to smart to have into the bucket of why wouldn't you have it? You have to be able to evolve your defense, to evolve the defense based on the risks that you're facing. And these risks really are evolving quickly. These adversary groups that have all these funny names that we give them, they're not funny. They're really talented and they really know what they're able to get away with. They know in many cases that they're not likely to be caught effectively by law enforcement. So we need to defend against them. And we need to be able to do that ourselves or with those we've contracted with to provide us with 24/7 by 365 monitoring. And depending upon how your organization is set up to lead a response. Many organizations have a CISO, but many don't. And really there's a level at which they really should, but they still don't. So what we've seen in our practice is an increase in the number of companies recognizing that they need it, but don't really need a full CISO, and they're willing to share one. So we've seen a rise in a virtual CISO, which in a lot of ways is really good because that's a person who's looking across a number of organizations and is going to be more sensitive to what's going on than necessarily somebody that is just laser focused on one organization. So I think the evolution is there. I think the other evolution we're seeing is a recognition on the part of organizations that IT now isn't what IT was years ago
Right.
when it was a support function. In most companies, if they're honest with themselves, boards of directors and senior managers are going to say that IT has evolved into an existential activity. It is going to be life and death to the company. And you really have to think about how you manage something that's that vital, that can put you out of business. Do you just say, well, it's the IT function. I'll go hire somebody to run IT and we're good to go. Or do you realize that it's evolved beyond that and that it's now a legal problem because of all the laws and regulations and how fast they're changing? And you have to have a good involvement from your general counsel or your external counsel if you don't have an in-house staff. You have to always ask the question, are we doing what we said we're doing? And are we doing what we ought to be doing? And historically, that's the kind of a question you would ask of somebody like your chief compliance officer. So we have the ability to take the skill set of a compliance officer or perhaps an internal auditor and apply those to this other existential issue, which is how are we securing our IT? Are we doing it right? Are we doing what we say? And are we evolving such that we're not getting surprised by the changes that are occurring, but we're anticipating them, we're planning for them, we're dealing with them, and then we're looking for the next ones.
Right. And yeah, like you said, planning now, it can't just be like, oh, it's a nice to have. We did this extra mile, which is the cyber security part of it, or information security part of it. It's like this is now needing to be a plan in your business plan, as like it's an existential part of our company, because if it gets breached, we're breached and we can't do business, right? So that's so you see that as
I really do see that as a sea change. I remember going back all those years. I have the advantage of being able to see how things were done then and what the effect of that was. We would run through a plan and then we would sort of celebrate because we'd finished the plan. And maybe we would plan again next year,
right.
or maybe on a 2-year planning cycle. That is gone.
Mm.
It is now continuous because the risk is continuous and the risk is evolving quickly. You can't just focus on what the laws tell you for a real simple reason. The internet technology and computer technology evolves at the speed of light. We all know that. But we also know that laws and regulations evolve at the speed of government. And those two things are not exactly the same.
Right.
So what's in the middle? And in the middle is us. And in the middle is our vendors. And in the middle are our contractors. And it's our overall approach to managing this cyberspace risk. Because remember, we always talk about cyberspace. But remember, it doesn't exist. There is no such place as cyberspace. Everything happens in a real world location. Now, it may be in a data center, in a rack, in a computer, in a virtual machine, but it's somewhere. And your data is always stored somewhere where it's accessible. You want to make sure that you're the one accessing it, and that if there's a problem, like a ransomware attack, that you have backup that the bad guys haven't found and encrypt it along with the original.
Yeah.
So it really, to me, seems like we're evolving into recognizing that if we live or die by having our cyber resources available, we need to just change the way we think about them
Right.
and stop thinking about them as the world of the techie. It's everyone's world.
Right.
Techies play a role in it, but like we said, so does counsel, so does HR, so does compliance, so does internal audit, so does pretty much everybody. And once we get there, then we can start thinking about the risk in real terms. Until then, we're leaving openings for the bad guys. And they are very, very good at finding and exploiting those openings and doing it in a way that can be devastating.
Right. Yeah, it's like what do companies want to be planning at? What rate do they want to be planning at the rate of which the threat evolves, the threats are evolving, or at the rate at which the laws are reacting to those threats? So that's a great warning, and I feel like if people are reading the news and not getting that into their plan yet, let Alan Brill on the Cyber Spotlight be the signal that they need to kick it into high gear and start planning for these types of things.
Whatever it is that it takes to get them to recognize the centrality of cyber to today's corporation, that it really is not some techie bunch of people over on the other side of the building, but it's whether you operate or not.
Yeah.
And once you really get that through your head, then you're going to treat it differently. You're going to treat the problem differently. You're going to understand where you have to make the investment to do it the right way. And that's an evolution that needs to happen.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's so great. That's a rich wisdom there for all the viewers. Just before we let you go here, just a couple more. We want to learn a little bit more about Alan still before we go. So I got a little this or that questionnaire for you.
Sure.
Are you more of a dog person or a cat person or other?
We don't have a pet right now, but we had two cats when my daughter was growing up. One we had for about 12 years, one we had for about 13 years. The first was named by my daughter Snoopy. And I remember when she was 3 years old, she would throw Snoopy over her shoulder and go up to her room, and they were both very happy. And after Snoopy passed away, my wife was working in a law office. And one day, somebody had the front door open and a cat came in, and it jumped up on her desk. It curled up in her inbox and went to sleep. And we took that as a sign. And that cat named Thumper was with us for 12 years and unfortunately passed away. But we loved them both. They were actually very dog-like cats.
Well, Snoopy the cat, Thumper the cat, that's those are good names for cats. That's funny. Do you use more Macs or PC personally and at Kroll?
Personally, I use more PCs, but I have done a lot of projects involving the Mac systems, going back a long ways to some interesting times in Cupertino.
Nice. Are you a sitting desk person or a standing desk? Have you ever dabbled in that area?
Yeah, it's interesting. My son-in-law had spinal surgery and ended up getting a standing desk, one that goes up and down.
Yeah.
And when I was visiting there, I tried the standing desk and I really went back to my sitting desk. I think part of it is historically, when I've been working, I'll often work with my laptop in my lap, literally. Right. So, you call it a laptop, why not use it as a laptop? And that's generally the way I've worked. But I have to say that 32 years ago, when I joined Kroll, I discovered that Jules Kroll, the founder of the company, had a stand-up desk in his office. Wow. And he was always using it. And I just never got used to it.
Yeah, fair enough. That's innovative of him back then, before it was a big trend. Alan, that's all we got for you today. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on the Cyber Spotlight. How can people, I'm sure they already know, but how can people get in contact with you, network with Kroll, or look into your services if they need them?
Sure. If you just go to kroll.com, it's, as they say, an easy name to remember. It's
Yep.
right up here.
Yep.
And you can put my name into the search bar. You'll find it. You'll find all sorts of information about what we're doing in cyber, both reactive and proactive. We have a very active practice that handles notifications where these incidents occur, and you have to go out to the victims and work with them. So we have a very full range of services, and we do them on a global basis. We're here, we're in Europe, we're in Asia, and we try to do it the same way all over so that we can provide a uniform means of accomplishing these tasks. And to do that, it means we can operate more efficiently and effectively because we learn quickly and we have ways of teaching each other what we do. So we're not all trying to reinvent a wheel. And that's been a terrific thing.
Great. Great. Well, people will check that out. And thank you again, for coming on the show and providing your wisdom and your expertise on what we talked about. I had a great time. Hope you did as well.
I sure did, Stephen. And anytime I can help, just give me a holler.